tensions between Iran and the West are raised another notch. Iran detains a British oil tanker 2 weeks after the UK seized one of its ships. Will Tehran and London find compromise, or is the situation going to spiral out of control? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fully Batibo. When the UK seized an Iranian oil tanker 2 weeks ago, Tehran warned of retaliation. Well, it appears Iran has carried out that threat. Iranian Revolutionary Guards detained a British vessel in the Strait of Hormuz on Friday. It was sailing towards a Saudi port when it suddenly changed course. A powerful council that works closely with Iran's supreme leader says the seizure is in response to the UK impounding an Iranian tanker. Tehran earlier said the Stetna Impero was involved in an accident with an Iranian fishing boat.
We were informed that a British-flagged oil tanker collided with a fishing boat. We tried to contact the tanker and find out how the accident happened, but unfortunately the British tanker didn't respond and changed its direction. Changing direction in that fashion is against international regulations and could lead to new accidents. Therefore, we requested help from military forces and judicial authorities in the region. The tanker was directed to Bandar Abbas port and is in custody at the order of judicial authorities.
Well, Britain has summoned Iran's envoy to the UK, and its foreign secretary says he's worried Iran may be going down a dangerous path. Neve Barker has more from London.
Britain has said that there will be a considered and robust response to the seizure of a British tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. If, according to Jeremy Hunt, Britain's Foreign Secretary, the tanker isn't released soon, there will be serious consequences. The Foreign Secretary tweeted on Saturday morning, calling the seizure of the tanker illegal, in sharp contrast to what he said was the legal detention of an Iranian vessel at the beginning of July off the coast of Gibraltar. That vessel is accused of carrying oil to Syria in breach of EU sanctions, and on Friday the authorities in Gibraltar determined that that vessel should be detained for a further 30 days. This is very much being seen in the UK as a tit-for-tat seizure, but as we know that the Grace 1 vessel off Gibraltar is going through some sort of legal process, it's not as simple as simply allowing the Grace 1 to go free and hoping that the Iranians will follow suit as well. When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, well, it is hugely important strategically, politically and economically. 18.5 million barrels of oil a day flow through the strait in comparison to 5 million that goes through the Suez Canal. It's hugely important for crude oil producing countries in the region when it comes to allowing their goods to go to global markets as well. This will undoubtedly have a political and economic impact not only in the region but globally as well. This is Neve Barker for Inside Story.
Well, there's been a series of incidents around the Strait of Hormuz since President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the 2015 nuclear deal and imposed new sanctions on Iran. In May, the United Arab Emirates said 4 of its oil tankers were targeted off its coast, and Saudi Arabia reported 2 of its ships were attacked. Last month, 2 vessels, Norwegian and Japanese-owned, were hit by blasts that caused major fires in the Gulf of Oman. In June, Iran said it shot down a U.S. drone which violated its airspace. This month, July 4th, British Royal Marine seized an Iranian tanker near Gibraltar, suspected of carrying oil bound for Syria. 2 weeks later, President Donald Trump said the U.S. military had taken down an Iranian drone that came too close to one of its naval vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, but Iran denied the drone was shot down. Well, let's now bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. Joining us from London, Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. In Tehran, we've got Mustapha Koshish, a political commentator and lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences. And in Washington, D.C., Joe Rubin, President of the Washington Strategy Group, a national security consulting firm. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being on Inside Story. Mustapha Koshish, what legitimate basis basis does Iran have for seizing this British ship? What rules have been broken for the Revolutionary Guards to seize this British tanker?
Hello. As a matter of fact, there are a number of reasons that could justify this seizure. First and foremost, as you heard during the package, your reporter said there has been a collision, and unfortunately, the tanker has defied calls by that fishing boat. It never returned the calls, and it switched off this tracking system, and then the Iranian boat filed a complaint at the State Port and Shipping and Maritime Organization, who asked the judiciary to issue a court ruling for the seizure of the tanker, and the IRGC only complied with the court's ruling. So that's according to maritime rules and regulations, international maritime rules and regulations, and to protect safety of navigation and shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, which is very much crowded, these days. Especially, we need to protect everything in the Strait of Hormuz.
But let me ask you: is the seizure
unnecessary accident of scene
for this British tank not retaliation for the Grace 1 Iranian tanker that was seized in Gibraltar 2 weeks ago?
I was explaining the same fact that, as a matter of fact, several hundred or tens of boats and tankers go through the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis, and some of them, violate the procedures that are in place and have been in place for the last several decades. But Iran normally warns them and let them continue their voyage and sailing. But when Iran has been approached by the UK through hostile action, and its supertanker has been seized, then there wouldn't be any reason left for Iran to show kindness, and therefore it goes for a serious practice of strict rules that they need to practice, actually, in order to protect the lives of the people and the environment. Okay. On the other hand, according to international law, when a hostile action is taken by a nation that would harm a second nation, that second nation is entitled to take reciprocal action according to international law, as long as the first nation continues to inflict harm on this harmed nation, the target nation.
Let me bring in Andreas.
What Iran has done is totally justifiable.
You say what Iran has done is justifiable. Andreas, Krieg in London, the rising tensions certainly couldn't come at a worse time for the UK. Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, is in the midst of a leadership election campaign to replace Theresa May as Prime Minister. He's warned of serious consequences. What do you expect those consequences will be, and what can Britain realistically do here?
Well, yes, thank you. I mean, he said the response would be robust. Would Iran not go further and actually release the tanker immediately? The question here is, what can the UK do at the moment? I think the UK is obviously bogged down in a lot of domestic, internal political quagmires where it's very difficult to get out of. Then we need to look at the levers of power that the UK has at its disposal at the moment in the Gulf. And so the Royal Navy has a presence in Bahrain. They are sending another frigate and warship into the region. But from a naval point of view, looking at the platforms, at 3 platforms that the Royal Navy will have, it's very, very difficult to actually really, make use of that power, and especially against an asymmetric threat that comes from Iran. And then looking at diplomatic levers of power, we shouldn't, we need to understand that here from a Western point of view more generally. Usually in this kind of situation, you use engagement, but you need to have a coercive component to actually put pressure on the Iranians. And that kind of coercive measures, these have been already kind of exploited to its maximum because of this maximum pressure campaign, and we have very, very few means available now to put more pressure on Iran because the sanctions already have been maxed out.
Let me just ask you before I bring in Joel in Washington, Andreas, why did the Brits seize the Iranian tanker in Gibraltar 2 weeks ago? The Iranian believes that the UK is following US orders here. What is the UK's role in this dispute?
I mean, look, the maximum pressure campaign obviously is an American thing, but it obviously brings all the parties to the JCPOA to the table, and obviously Britain is part of that. Britain is in a very ambiguous situation here because on the one hand, they do want to leave any backdoor open for negotiations and engagement with Iran to make this JCPOA a success despite all the pressure. But on the other hand, they're also trying to suggest to Washington that they will take action whenever Iran is in breach of international law and sanctions. And that particularly was the case with that oil tanker that went against EU law and EU sanctions to deliver oil to the Syrian regime. So it was taking legitimate and lawful actions in that respect. And it's also about signaling to the US that, that Britain will not be soft on Iran when it is in breach. And the same goes to the Hezbollah decision a couple of months ago to basically target Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, which again is in line with the Trump administration's hard-line view on Iran's activities across the region. But all that being said, they're trying to balance this with a diplomatic engagement. They're trying to suggest to the Iranians that we're still willing to talk, but there are certain red lines that Britain wants to enforce, and that's what they did.
All right. I see Mustapha Koshish in Tehran doesn't agree with you. I'll bring you in just a second, Mustapha, but let me just get Joe Rubin's view first. Joe, how do you view this latest escalation in the region? Is it a foreseeable response to Britain's seizure of the Iranian tanker in Gibraltar 2 weeks ago?
Well, this incident is not just and was not just foreseeable, but the entire tit-for-tat explanation that we had earlier of drones being shot down on both sides, that was all highly predictable. The American policy in this, President Trump's policy, is, I believe, ultimately to try to break the regime. It's a maximum pressure policy, and it has not led to diplomatic engagement. So we're in a very dangerous spot right now. We're in a tinderbox. So this back and forth about who's right to seize whose ship and who has legitimacy and who doesn't is completely the wrong conversation from what we should be having.
Do you think,
but here we are.
Yeah,
we should be having a conversation about actually diplomacy.
Yeah. Do you think this incident gives ammunition to hardline voices in the U.S. like John Bolton who want regime change in Iran?
Without a doubt, this is intentional to create this pressure cooker to try to see if the regime in Iran, in Tehran, will do acts like this that are dangerous and risky and provocative, and they are. That's intentional to try to find a predicate to launch military strikes. We have to remember here in Washington, there is not a lot of support. In fact, there's very minimal support for military action. Just last week, the House of Representatives passed language on a bipartisan basis requiring specific authorization by the president to go to war with Iran. So the temperature here towards war is very, very cold. But that means that there have to be other avenues. And so the administration, they see this as a win-win for them. Iran behaving badly, maximum pressure still on, and hopefully from their perspective, getting allies like Britain, who wanted to stay in the nuclear deal, to change their attitude towards Iran and get more bellicose.
All right, let's take a closer look now at why the Strait of Hormuz is so important. It's the only sea passage linking the Gulf's biggest oil producers to the rest of the world. 17 billion barrels of oil flow through this waterway every day. That's a fifth of the world's supply. It's only 33 kilometers wide and its narrowest point. Andreas, the Brits are temporarily halting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. This is a vital international shipping route. How can freedom of navigation be maintained now?
Very difficult. As I said before, the Iranians are not working in a conventional space from a maritime point of view. They're not using conventional maritime power. So by just putting, and I think it's important, the first step that the United States already suggested, and I think Britain will be on board as well, is creating a multilateral maritime mission in the region to basically create a deterrence regime against the IRGC's unconventional, asymmetric methods and strategies in place. But that on its own, as I said, is not going to be enough, because if you look at how the Iranians operate, using smaller skiffs, smaller boats, smaller vessels to harass a much bigger tankers, and then looking at the limited number of capacity that the US, Britain, and also the GCC states have in terms of naval capacity, we need more than just having warships in the regions to build that deterrence regime up. I think in order to enforce certain red lines, we need to have people on board the ships. And I think, vessel protection teams might be a way moving forward. They could be contractors, they could be armed personnel in uniform, but that's the only way you can create a deterrence by denial regime, because by just posturing and putting a few warships in place, that's not going to stop the IRGC from doing what they have been doing over the last 2 months.
Yeah. Mustapha Koshish in Tehran, what is the overall Iranian strategy here? On the one hand, you have Foreign Minister Zarif, who's in New York talking diplomacy. And on the other hand, you have the Revolutionary Guards making all these moves in the Strait of Hormuz. What is Iran trying to achieve? What is the message here?
Well, first and foremost, this is a wrong understanding of the situation. This is not the IRGC. And remember that I just said that that's been a fishing boat from the private sector filing a complaint to the state-run shipping and maritime organization. The judiciary, the court has issued a ruling. This is the state that's standing united behind this stance, and I'll explain it why. But before that, as you just mentioned, Mr. Zarif, he just a few minutes ago, he posted a tweet where he asked the British to stop their aid and helps and assistance to the United States economic terrorism against Tehran if they want to see their, if they don't want to see any similar events in future. Because the point here is that Iranians have shifted their strategy since a couple of months ago. Iranians waited for talks, and they had talks for decades. Then they waited for the merits of the nuclear deal, and they showed tolerance that they call strategic tolerance. But they came to realize that they are just in compliance, and the nuclear deal that was supposed to be a win-win game, now it has become a win-lose game. So Tehran shifted strategy to show that the time and the era of hit and run is gone.
Right.
That's not just in the military field, but in political, economic, and every other field.
But is this strategy really going to pay off at a time when Iran was it seems, gaining allies with the Germans and the French, who were trying to find a way to circumvent the U.S. sanctions? Do these moves really pay off?
They have never, ever done anything. They have just been expressing political support for the nuclear deal. But as a matter of fact, they've done nothing in support of economic moves to cooperate with Tehran, despite all their 11 promises of cooperation after the nuclear deal was abrogated by the United States. And that's a violation of the nuclear deal, by the way. Tehran, rest assured that if it doesn't change this balance, the situation would continue as such, I mean, similar to the status quo, and it would be forced under pressures to comply with the nuclear deal. It is sending a message to the Europeans that if the nuclear deal is valuable, they should do something and make the cost, pay the cost to keep it alive. Otherwise, they may not pressure Tehran and expect Tehran to do nothing and endure the pressures in exchange for nothing. Tehran is sending this grave message to the Europeans.
Okay, Joel Rubin, your response to what Mustapha Koshish has just said on the Iranian strategy. Is Iran being counterintuitive here?
Well, it's hard to see what alternatives the Iranians believe they have, but they do have alternatives. And attacking the Europeans, as the foreign minister just did, is not the right approach if you want to build alliances against the American policy. They're actually pushing the Europeans towards the American policy, which I think is a wrong-headed policy. I see our policy right now as driving this conversation in this direction, and there are no good military solutions. This idea that somehow ships and planes and drones are going to resolve the long-simmering tensions that we have with Iran related to its nuclear program, related to its regional activities, that's just a fantasy. We need hard-headed diplomacy, and we need to be engaging. But for Iran to undermine its European allies right now, this is not going to help advance its cause.
Right, but the Iranians are saying that for any talks with the U.S. to happen, because the Trump administration, of course, has said that it wants to renegotiate the nuclear deal with no preconditions. But the Iranians say that for that to happen, that the sanctions need to be lifted. Some sanctions needs to be lifted. Do you see the Trump administration giving away, some of these sanctions at some point?
Well, I think that the Trump administration should go back right now into the nuclear deal and get to a next wave of a nuclear negotiation. So could there be improvement? Yes. Will there be? Will the Trump administration do it? There are no signals that they want to. There have been some tiny signals, though, and that's, for example, Senator Rand Paul, a Republican ally of the president, did speak with the foreign minister. And who knows where they've come out on this, but we need to find paths to getting to a discussion. This president has said he wants to talk. I don't believe it's fully genuine. That said, maybe the Iranians should try it. But we're in a space right now where the United States, the sanctions that we have enacted in violation of the nuclear deal, they are causing this situation. But this situation, as we're watching it, is leading us into a direct military conflict that really is not going to have any winners.
Andreas, Krieg in London, where does this leave the Europeans, especially France and Germany, who have been trying to keep the JCPOA alive? They've expressed solidarity with the UK in this latest incidents. What happens now as far as the Europeans are concerned?
A good question here. I mean, we all agree here, I think, that maximum pressure led to maximum resistance, and that's not going to go anywhere. And the problem is that we've exploited all other means of diplomatic engagement. And I think the Europeans realize that. And the reason the Iranians are behaving the way that they are behaving is because they feel like they're with the back against the wall. They have nothing to lose anymore because, you know, they're living under maximum sanctions. It is hurting them. It's for them. They consider it an act of war and terrorism, as they've said publicly. So what can the Europeans do in order to salvage that deal is basically allowing the benefits that were promised to the Iranians to actually trickle down and get to the people of Iran. That hasn't happened so far. This index that they were trying to set up, this kind of mechanism to allow for funds to come in, bypassing the sanctions regime by the Americans, bypassing dollar sanctions, hasn't really worked so far. It is a concept. Nobody knows whether and to what extent it is actionable, considering that companies in Europe will have to, are faced with a question. If they do business with Iran, they cannot do business in dollar markets, particularly the United States. And they know that there is very little in terms of incentive in doing business in Iran because businesses there will be relatively limited. And at the same time, they might lose out on a lot more lucrative contracts in the United States. So that in itself hasn't worked out. This mechanism, I don't see whether this mechanism can actually get off the ground. And by just talking and not delivering, they haven't given the Iranians a lifeline. And I think Tehran, for the most part, has given up the hope that there is something coming out of Europe from the E3 that might be actionable.
All right. Mustapha Koshish, Andreas says Tehran has given up hope. So how far are they willing to take all this? Will Iran go as far as closing off the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, first and foremost, what were people in London thinking when they seized the Iranian supertanker at the request of the United States? What did they expect Iran to do? Did they expect that Iran would sit idly and do nothing? Well, of course, Iranians tolerated that for a few days, and there was a good hope that the UK could reverse the whole situation and course of actions on Thursday through a court ruling by the Gibraltar court to release the Iranian tanker. And that would de-escalate the situation. Now, the UK seems to be very much worried about post-Brexit economic, problems that it would have. So it needs the United States much. And they are dealing with the US that's run by the president. So they are, President Trump, and they are treating, right now, Jeremy Hunt is approaching Tehran with an arrogant language, posing very serious threats to Tehran that they would show a robust response. That's not going to work. It would backfire, and it would, aggravate the situation.
Let me give Joel Rubin in Washington the last
Let me
word,
give you the final sentence.
Yes, go on, final sentence.
The last sentence is, what's wrong with the language of respect? If the UK shows good intention, releases the Iranian supertanker, and shows that it's willing for diplomacy, I believe then Iranians would try to have a positive look at the situation of this Stena Impero tanker.
Joel Rubin in Washington, you have the last word. Careful calculations right now by the British authorities. At the same time, the U.S. Defense Department has confirmed that it's deploying U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia to provide an additional deterrent, they say, to the threat in the region. Does this deployment not fuel the risk of a full-scale conflict?
Well, it's all heading in the wrong direction, and the signals of sending military forces to the region is completely counter to the idea that we're going to increase diplomacy. These aren't forces that are going to lead to a ground invasion. It's a small number, less than 1,000. The danger here is that something big is going to happen. And when something big happens, that mobilizes the forces in a bigger way. And then we have a real major conflict. And the Iranians, they have other cards to play. They have the nuclear program to restart even more aggressively. In the U.S., we have other cards to play. The president believes that he can use our military in ways that he has publicly stated would be overwhelming. And so this is a danger moment. And this is where the Europeans should be stepping in more aggressively diplomatically rather than creating more tensions and more dynamics on the shipping lanes.
All right, we'll leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Mustapha Koshish, Andreas, Krieg, and Joel Rubin. Thank you very much. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Foli Batibo, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.